Have you ever wished that you had a better career, more impact on the world, a better financial situation, or even just better relationships? Well, I actually believe that the quality of your life in those areas depends largely on the quality of the decisions that you make. So that's why even though I've had some decent amount of success as an entrepreneur and as an investor, I've become an ardent student of decision making. My name is Flavio Rump, and in this video, which is part of a larger video series, I bring you some of the best decision-making processes that some of the world's best decision makers actually use. Today, we're going to look at how Ray Dalio, who is a very successful hedge fund manager and an excellent teacher, and his fund has over $100 billion of assets under management, actually makes decisions. And he was kind enough to write this book here, which is called Principles, and that I highly recommend that you check out, and I'm linking it in the description below. And one of the concepts from this book that I found the most useful is something called believability-weighted decision making. In today's video, I want you to learn three things. One, what is believability? Second, how do you assess someone's believability? And thirdly, how do you actually combine different opinions from different people with different believability to make the best decisions you could be making? So let's get started. Number one, what is believability? Now, Ray Dalio defines believability as, or people with high believability, as people who have demonstrated track record in the area concerned about. And he goes on further to say if they've done that successfully at least 3 times, that means that they have higher believability. The second thing he looks out for is the reasoning skills that someone displays. How well can they articulate the underlying cause-effect relationships that lead them to their conclusions? And the third thing that I'm adding is you also want to sort of check for someone's agendas and motivations, right? If someone is trying to sell you something, like a used car salesperson, the advice they're going to give you is going to be heavily biased or could be heavily biased, right? So you're going to have to discount that, right? Okay, so let's look at how do you actually assess someone's believability. Now, the first thing you could do in terms of the track record is you can simply ask them, hey, what is your track record in that area, right? And that's going to give you some amount of information. And, you know, if they cannot answer that question at all, you know, that's a very bad sign. But if they give a good answer, that means like, okay, it's better than nothing. But maybe you still want, depending on the importance of the decision you're making, you might want to go and talk to a few other people that ideally also are somewhat believable, that have worked with that person in the past, or that know this person in the regard you want to consider about. And then you can find out what they think of how that person has been successful or not in that specific area, right? Second, how do you assess someone's reasoning, right? Well, first you're just going to ask them, how did you come to your conclusions? You're going to listen to what they have to say. And there, you know, you're just going to have your skills and backgrounds to sort of see whether they can accurately assess the cause-effect relationships. You also want to consider how well they're taking in new information. How well they've, how many questions are they asking about the situation at hand? If, let's say you're coming with a problem to them and they are just giving you an answer flat out without asking any clarifying questions, that may or may not be a good advice, right? You want someone who is deeply concerned with finding what the situation looks like, the map of reality, the truth, and only once they have a differentiated sort of point of view of what the situation is like, then they give you an advice. So very, very important to look out for that. And then thirdly, how do you find out if there's hidden motivations or incentives? Now again, you might just have to use a sort of checklist to see in your head whether the person could be biased in any way or not, right? I think the example in a shop or you know, a car dealership is pretty clear. They want to sell you something. There's clear financial incentive. It might also be a little more subtle. Let's say you have a work colleague where you're trying to decide, you know, what system you should implement or, you know, what kind of marketing campaign you should run. If that person is sort of competitive with you in terms of like there's a promotion coming up and they want it and they don't, so it means that they don't want you to have it, that may or may not, depending on who they are, may color the kind of advice that they're going to give you. So it's very important to keep in mind what the relationship is between you and that person and what incentives or agendas might be guiding you and them when you guys are talking with each other, right? So now let's look at a concrete example of where we're going to talk to a few different people to make a decision about something important and how we can actually use the believability-weighted decision-making algorithm that Ray Dalio proposes. So let's look at that. So let's assume you have to pick a database for your company, and you're sitting with your engineering team and you're trying to come up with that decision. So let's say you're sitting here at a table and there's the four of you. So there's George sitting here, there's Mary sitting here, and there's Joanna sitting here, and you are sort of sitting here. Okay, now we want to assess what is the best system. So let's look at what everyone's recommendations are, and then what their believability is. So George is first to speak, and he says, I'm a great engineer, and I've worked with NeverSQL for 10 years, and everything I ever wanted to worked, and I think we should go with NeverSQL, right? So he goes with NeverSQL. Now the question is, what is George's believability? Now, if we look, we wanted to find out his track record, which is the first thing Dalio goes for. What would we do? We'd say, well, George, please tell us, how often have you had to select, install, maintain a database for a very diverse set of stakeholders to their long-term satisfaction, right? And George goes, well, actually, it was only one of the users. I never really had to do that, so I don't really know. So his believability in terms of track record is very, very low, right? Now let's look at his reasoning. His reasoning is like, he's worked with it for a long time and it's never made a mistake. So maybe we should go with that. So overall, I would say maybe 1 out of 5 for track record and 1 out of 5 for his reasoning. So maybe overall believability is 2. I'm not seeing anything obvious that would, he's not trying to sell us something necessarily. There's no discounting needed for incentives or motivations. Now let's look at what Mary says, right? Mary says, well, I had never had to do that, any of these things, like selecting and installing the database. But I thought it would be useful to do a little bit of a process around this issue. So I went and interviewed all the stakeholders. I gathered all their criteria. I asked them to rank the criteria by importance. I then created a spreadsheet out of that, took the 10 most commonly used databases in the market, ranked them by these criteria, took the top 3, created a sandbox environment of the company, tested all the supposed use cases that we have, simulated it, did load testing and so forth, and based off of that, the database called HerSQL is the one that came out on top, and I recommend we go with that one, right? So let's look at Mary's believability. It seems like she's open and saying, I've never had to do that, so she doesn't really have a track record around selecting a database. So maybe 0 out of 5 in terms of her track record. But her reasoning, at least to me, it seems very sound, right? So I will give her a 5 out of 5 for her reasoning, and it doesn't seem like we need to discount that because she seems to not have any ulterior motives, at least that we know about. So let's give her a 5 for her believability around that, right? Then Joanna speaks and says, I know a little bit something about databases, and I went and I spoke with a few insiders, and it seems pretty clear that the consensus is that we should go with NeverSQL, right? So she also recommends NeverSQL. Now the question is, what's her believability, right? Now let's just assume, for the sake of the example here, that you actually know that Joanna's husband is the founder of NeverSQL, right? So she might be A, biased by that, and B, she might even financially benefit from the decision of us to go with NeverSQL, right? So even if her track record was a bit higher, maybe 2 out of 5 or so, and even if I think the reasoning of going and speaking with insiders is good, maybe she just spoke with her husband, right? So we can't really give her too much believability for her statement. So again, I would go with maybe total in terms of, maybe 2 for track record, maybe 2 for her reasoning, but then discount that by the fact that her husband is the founder of NeverSQL, so I'm going to go with a total believability of 2. Now, let's say you're actually very humble. You say you've never had to do this, and you have no idea, so you're just going to say question mark, and your own believability, you assess it at 0, right? So now, bringing it all together, Ray Dalio, what he does is that he actually goes and he sums the believability of the different recommendations to come up with the conclusion, right? So you can see if we did this democratically, you would have 2 votes for NeverSQL and 1 vote for HerSQL, and you might be tempted to go with NeverSQL. But if you actually sum the believabilities of the different recommendations, like we're going to do right now, you'll actually see that the believability of never equals total recommendation is 4. And you do the same thing for the believability of her sequel. It's only one person who recommends that. But we've assessed her believability at 5, right? So 5 is bigger than 4. So the algorithm would predict that we should go with her sequel. And again, this is just a recommendation, but it seems, if we look at all the data and the facts, intuitively, it seems not that bad to go with Mary's recommendation, who's really put in all the work. Even though she doesn't have a lot of experience, it seems like her overall believability in this case is the highest. So we should go with her sequel. Now, I hope this explains how the believability weighted algorithm actually works in practice. If you want to look at a lot more great examples of how you can assess someone's believability, I've created a blog post on Medium with lots and lots of examples. You can find the link in the description below. Now, I hope you don't regret the decision you made to watch that video and actually learn something useful. And if you want to make another great decision, now is the time to subscribe to my channel, hit the bell button below, hit the like button on that video, and I'm very excited to bring you more great content from some of the world's greatest decision makers. I'll see you soon.